Over my 10 years gardening, I've made my fair share of mistakes, and the category of watering mistakes is one I'm intimately familiar with. So in this video, we're gonna go over 7 of the most common watering problems and what to do about them. And this video is sponsored by our friends over at HoseLink, but more on that later. The first mistake is one that technically I am doing right now, but I'm not super stressed about it, and that is watering over the top of your plants, like my little pineapple sage right here. Is this a bad idea or is this a good idea? You hear all the time a few reasons why it's a bad idea. The first one is a little bit absurd. It's that in the middle of the day, the water droplets on the leaves will actually focus the sunlight and then start those leaves on fire. And just through simple observation of the natural world, we know that that's not the case. Otherwise, prairies and meadows around the country would burst into flames on a simple rainy day. So that's not the reason why you should not water overhead. The only thing I would avoid here is watering something like this overhead, or maybe something like a squash or a tomato, things that are prone to diseases where moisture increases the chance of that disease actually happening. To me, I think it's actually somewhat okay to water overhead if you feel like it, if you're maybe a little bit lazy, or you just have containers like this and there's no irrigation on them. So if you want to be safe, the way to water and guarantee less chance of disease is just to come in on like a container and just come in like that. And go low to the ground, low and slow. It's a good way to get some water in. But as we all do, like to come out in the garden and just get jobs done, if you do want to come out and do this really quickly on your containers or in your raised beds or in-ground beds, just do it early in the morning, and that gives it time to evaporate over the course of the day. And that brings us to our next mistake. And that mistake is picking the wrong time of day to water. And there's some important caveats here. As I've been growing for 12, 13 years now, every season I just refine my techniques a little bit more, and I learned that rules sometimes are meant to be broken. And so when you look at a bed like this, I've got some melons right here, some cantaloupes, and they need water, water them. That's the general rule. So the best time to water your plants actually has nothing to do with what time of day it is. It's just when the plant needs water, and we'll talk about how to know when that's the case in a couple tips. But assuming you're coming out and doing your daily maintenance, or you're watering that couple times a week on a schedule, you'd rather water in the morning. And the reason why is pretty simple. It's because light is coming in the morning, and over the course of the day, the plant is going to use resources, right? It's going to transpire, it's going to use up water, and so you want to give it that water when it can use it the best. Now, as you get towards that middle of the day, again, if the plant needs water, hit it with that water, but watering right in the middle of the day, generally speaking, not a great idea, because if I come in here and I give my bed some water and it's blazing hot noon, I'm losing quite a bit of that water to evaporation, especially on like maybe a windy day, before it even gets used by the plant's roots. Then you get to the evening. And I would say I generally avoid watering in the evening, but I'm not necessarily extremely against it, especially if I'm watering down at the base or I have some irrigation, then that water is making it directly in the soil. What I definitely would not do is come out, as the sun sets and do something like that, because that's sort of setting the plant up for perhaps a bit of fungal issues or maybe some rot or something like that. So as a rule of thumb, morning, late morning, maybe sunset time at the base of the plant are your best times. Watering is really about giving your plants that Goldilocks amount of water, not too much and not too little. And so this mistake has to do with giving your plants too little water. So if we take a look at this bed right here, this is peppers and some zinnias, and frankly, it looks awesome. I'm not doing either of the mistakes I'm about to share with you, but to know if you're underwatering, generally speaking, you're looking for some sort of wilt in the leaves. And the smaller the leaves, sometimes the harder it is to detect if you are underwatering. So compared to a pepper, maybe take something like thyme or oregano. Really, in those cases, you're looking for that whole bushy herb structure to kind of flatten. And then you know that it's really low on water. But for something like peppers, this pepper is going to hold up pretty well to underwatering, but the leaves will start to flop like this. And then this is where it really is important to become a gardener, learn how the plants work. Because if you take a look at the squash behind me, in the middle of the day, in summer, when squash is really ripping, it is going to wilt. Those leaves are going to fall a bit, and that's sort of a natural protection mechanism by the plant. Now, if those leaves don't then perk back up as temperatures cool and you move into the evening, then you have a really clear signal that that squash needs water. And also think about the watering needs of the plant itself. So something like a squash with huge leaves and huge squash fruits, it's gonna need generally more water than something like this little bell pepper right here. And so to me, underwatering tends to happen to gardeners who are growing in bigger containers because they underestimate how much water it takes to actually hydrate this bed. And our next mistake tends to happen to people who are growing in smaller containers. Overwatering is a problem I see most often in gardeners that have containers. And those containers tend to be something that is at least somewhat solid, not super permeable, like maybe a fabric grow bag. So take this whiskey barrel, or if you're growing in plastic pots, a lot of gardeners tend to overlove their plants. And so every day, you're coming out and you're drenching your container thinking that you have to do something for these plants to grow. And again, it gets back to knowing the plants that you're growing, because certainly some containers and some plants would want to be watered nearly every day. Imagine you're growing a tomato plant in a 3-gallon container and that tomato plant's pretty big. Well, that's a small container for that tomato plant, so you're probably gonna have to water it once or even twice a day. But then you get to a situation like this herb bed where I have basil, rosemary, and sage. The only one of these that even needs a reasonable amount of water, I would say, is probably the basil, which is right here, but it's not even that big. And so what I like to do to watch for overwatering is 2 things. Number 1, you can expect the plant. Counterintuitively, it will sometimes wilt if it's overwatered, and that's because the roots are waterlogged, so they don't have the ability to get any oxygen and sort of work as they are intended to work, with a mixture of taking up nutrients, oxygen, and water, because there's just water kind of sucked right around those roots. So I'll look at that, and then I'll also do the finger test, and this works for under and overwatering. It's a very classic technique. You just come in and you bring your finger in and you move it aside, and you just see when you hit drier soil. So if you don't hit drier soil for 4 or 5 inches, really good chance you don't need to water. If you start hitting dry soil 5, 6, 7 inches deep, probably time to water. You're underwatering those plants. And so it really is that Goldilocks zone, knowing the plants, knowing the container, and knowing your own habits. Next mistake you might be making is just using the wrong tool for the job. Back in the early days, I was watering this whole thing with a watering can. It was arduous, it was painful. Now we've put in irrigation, and I have a hose that I can extend out to every single bed if it needs to be spot treated with any extra water in case I'm underwatering. And the best part about this is it retracts. Which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, our friends over at HoseLink. This was my saving grace. When I first moved in here almost 4 years ago, I put it right here. I put a garden setup right here, and I could quickly extend this hose out and in to every single bed before I had irrigation, and it replaced the watering can that I was refilling actually on the side of my house. So if you think about how I want to spend time in the garden, I do want to water my plants, of course, but I don't want to walk back and forth into the backyard to fill up a watering can and walk out here over and over and over again. So just putting this right here, 82 feet, retractable reel, made my life way easier. And then I started playing around with some of the extra accessories they have. The thing I love so much about the system is the quick release is far and away one of the easiest ones that I've ever used. So it's a simple twist off. And then for me, the long handled one is great because I'm tall, and we just mentioned better to water at the base of plants if you can. So in my herb bed, I don't have to kind of bend all the way in. I can just take the long handle and come right down at the base and put a nice kind of like breaker stream of water. I mean, that's a beautiful little stream. I can just come in like that, hit it, come in over here and hit it right at the base. And I've watered my containers really easily. And then they have something that I'm starting to experiment with. I've been experimenting lately with some beneficial inoculants. So this is not a pesticide, herbicide, or fungicide. It is actually a light fertilizer with a lot of beneficial life in it. And I'm testing it on my squash to see if I don't have a problem with powdery mildew if I spray. So with this, again, with the quick connect, I can just come on and off, boom, twist the nozzle to the level of dilution that I want, give it a nice spray. And this would be one of the few cases where I would water on top of the plants because I'm trying to apply a treatment to their surface. So the thing I love about HoseLink is not only is their retractable reel far and away the most durable, there are a lot on the market. These ones last the longest, so your money is actually well spent. But the quick connect system and then all the different implements they have make it easy to water no matter what you're trying to water. I just showed you the surface. They have oscillators, deep root waters, and so much more. So we love HoseLink here at Epic Gardening. If you want to check them out, the link is in the description. And on to the next mistake. A really big mistake you are probably making, especially if you're a beginner grower, is watering every plant the same. Kind of like a blanket watering strategy for your whole garden. So take a look at this plant right here. These are my vining tomato plants. This one's actually almost 6 feet tall. I'm 6'4", so it's pretty tall up here. This is far along in its life. Not only do tomatoes need more water than say an herb garden with sage and thyme and oregano, but a mature, large tomato plant needs even more water than that because there's way more leaves to support and there's a lot of juicy tomatoes hanging down below. So each plant requires its own watering, and over the course of that plant's life, it needs to be watered a little bit differently. So as this tomato matures into the summer, it's going to be hotter, which means water is going to evaporate from the soil quicker, and the plant will probably need to use more water, and it's bigger. So the watering needs of this tomato plant over the course of the season might double or triple compared to that early transplant that you set out. And then you have something like my pepper patch over here, which has a completely different strategy because the plants are a lot shorter. They can hold on to water a touch better, and they can tolerate a little bit more heat. So it's really about understanding the plants that you want to grow and what those plants need as far as their watering goes. And speaking of those peppers, this mistake is a garden planning mistake, and you can avoid it by just thinking a little bit more about what you're putting into what spots of the garden. So this is my pepper patch, and over the season, this has slowly transitioned to be mostly peppers. Now there's some flowers sprinkled here and there, and most of these flowers have similar watering needs and even light needs as the peppers do. So I know that if it's on irrigation or if I'm coming in with a hose and watering, I don't have to give this one a little bit more, this one a little bit less. An example of doing this wrong would be to say plant maybe something that loves water, like a big pumpkin patch, next to something that really hates being watered that frequently. So if you were to put like a big pumpkin right next to some drought tolerant herbs or flowers, they might not have a great time. So think about that. Think about the design of your garden. It's not just watering, it's lighting conditions, it's the different types of plants that go well together. And speaking of, there is some science to the way that plants can be combined. So check this video out for our guide on companion planting that is science-based. And thanks to Hoselink for sponsoring the video. We are huge fans of them here at Epic Gardening. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.